He destroyed her in front of 7 of America's most powerful mob bosses, and he called it a business decision. She didn't cry, she didn't argue, she just smiled, stood up, and walked out of the room. Within 48 hours, his empire began to crumble, not because of enemies, but because he had just gotten rid of the only person keeping it all standing. Like and comment the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has come. Don't miss the ending, it will leave you speechless. The council chamber had no windows. That was intentional. The men who built it 3 generations ago understood something fundamental about the nature of power, that it required darkness to feel absolute, that decisions made under artificial light carried a different weight than those reached with sunlight bleeding in from the outside world. Outside meant witnesses. Outside meant the ordinary world, with its laws and its cameras and its comfortable illusions about how things actually worked. In here, there was only the long mahogany table, the 7 high-backed chairs, the amber glow of recessed lighting that turned every face into something ancient and dangerous, and the understanding, unspoken, bone-deep, that whatever happened inside this room stayed buried with the men who'd been present for it. Vivienne Ashcroft Viscari had been inside this room 11 times over the past 14 years. She knew which chair creaked when Aldo Ferrante shifted his weight to the left. She knew that Dmitry Volkov kept a flask of birch vodka in the interior pocket of his jacket, and that he only reached for it when negotiations turned personal. She knew that the youngest of the 7, Marcus Hale, barely 50, second generation, still carrying the hunger of someone who'd watched his father bleed for what he now owned, always sat closest to the exit, not because he was afraid, but because he liked knowing the geometry of escape. Old habit from leaner years. Some habits, she'd learned, never fully died. They just got expensive suits draped over them. She also knew that her husband had been planning something for weeks. She'd seen it in the small things. The way he stopped including her in calls that used to root through her first. The way Celeste Rowan had begun appearing at functions she'd previously been kept away from, always a half step behind Damien, always dressed in something that cost more than most people's cars, always watching Vivienne with an expression that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite fear, but lived in the uncomfortable territory between them. The way Damien had started holding her gaze just a half second too long when she spoke, like he was measuring the distance between what she knew and what she suspected. Vivienne had always been good at reading rooms. She'd been reading this one for 14 years. She took her seat at Damien's left, the position she'd occupied at every council meeting since they were married, and she folded her hands on the table and she waited. Around her, the 7 families settled into their chairs with the practiced, unhurried movements of men accustomed to having the world accommodate their schedule. Aldo Ferrante, 73, the oldest of them, with hands like quarried stone and eyes that had watched 3 generations of his own people die violently. He sat directly across from her, and when their gazes met briefly, he gave her the smallest of nods. It meant nothing and everything. She returned it. Damien stood at the head of the table. He was 38, and he was built like someone who'd spent his 20s being told no, and his 30s making sure it never happened again. 6 feet of calculated presence, dark suit, jaw that could have been carved. He had his father's cheekbones and none of his father's patience, and that combination had served him extraordinarily well in the years since he'd taken the Syndicate's leadership by forcing a vote that everyone knew wasn't really a vote. He had soldiers. His father had had vision. Damien had always believed soldiers were enough. "Before we begin," he said, and his voice carried the easy authority of someone who'd never once doubted whether he'd be listened to, "there's a matter of internal structure I want the council to be aware of." Vivienne felt the room change. Not visibly, nothing so dramatic. But she'd spent enough years in chambers like this one to feel the atmospheric shift when something unexpected was about to happen. The way the air itself seemed to hold still, the way the men around the table went fractionally more alert without appearing to move at all. Dmitry Volkov's hand drifted toward his jacket pocket. Marcus Hale's eyes moved from Damien to her and back again in a single smooth motion. "Going forward," Damien continued, "Celeste Rowan will be representing the Viscari family in all interfamily communications and negotiations. She'll hold full political authority on behalf of the Syndicate." Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that has mass and temperature. "That includes," Damien said, turning to look at Vivienne directly for the first time since they'd entered the room. Every privilege and access currently extended to my wife. Vivienne didn't move. She was aware of her own breathing. Slow, even. The kind of breathing she'd learned to maintain in situations that wanted her to come apart. She was aware of her hands, flat on the mahogany, perfectly still. She was aware of every eye in the room swinging toward her face, looking for the fracture, for the flinch, for the thing that would tell them how this was going to go. She gave them nothing. She looked at Damien for a long moment. His expression was composed, confident, carrying that particular flavor of certainty that men wore when they'd convinced themselves they were being decisive rather than reckless. He believed this was a clean transaction, a reorganization. He'd weighed the variables, reached a conclusion, and was now implementing it the way he implemented everything, by announcing it to a room full of people who had no choice but to absorb it. He had never understood that some variables couldn't be quantified. Vivienne stood slowly. She smoothed the front of her black dress with both hands, a single, unhurried gesture that she was conscious of even as she made it, conscious of how it would read, what it would say about her. Then she looked at Damien with an expression that gave nothing away, and she smiled, not warmly, not coldly, just the particular smile of a woman who has seen exactly this coming and has already decided she doesn't need the room she's standing in. She walked out. No argument, no scene, no backward glance at the 7 most powerful men in organized crime watching her go. The door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click that somehow carried more weight than a slam would have. Behind her, she heard Aldo Ferrante's chair scrape against the stone floor. "I'll continue this meeting another day." She was already in the corridor. The compound sat on 40 acres of upstate New York countryside that Damien's father had purchased in the late 90s through 7 layers of shell companies. The main house was limestone and glass, 3 stories, built to look like money rather than to feel like a home, which, Vivienne had always thought, was precisely what it was. She'd lived inside it for 11 years, and she'd never once felt like the walls belonged to her. The evening air hit her when she came through the side door, cool and carrying the smell of cut grass and something darker underneath, petrichor maybe. The earth, after rain. She stopped on the stone steps and breathed it in and let herself feel, just for a moment, the specific texture of what had just happened to her. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Multiple sets, unhurried, deliberate, and she turned. Aldo Ferrante had followed her out. Behind him came the others, one by one, filing out of the compound's side entrance like men who'd decided simultaneously that the air inside wasn't worth breathing anymore. Dmitry Volkov, Marcus Hale, the Castellano brothers, Raphael and Enzo, who ran the Eastern port operations and rarely appeared without each other. Sungjin Park, whose family controlled 3 states' worth of logistics infrastructure and who'd said perhaps 40 words in Vivienne's presence over the past decade, every one of them considered and precise. And finally Benitez, Eduardo Benitez, who'd rebuilt the Gulf Coast operations from rubble after the federal crackdown 8 years ago, and who still walked with the slight favoring of a leg that had healed wrong after an incident he never discussed. 7 men. Every family represented, standing on the lawn in the gathering dark. Aldo stopped a few feet from her. He was a big man gone soft in the middle with age, but the softness was deceptive. There was still something in his posture that made the air around him feel heavier. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You knew," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "I suspected," Vivienne said, "and you said nothing." "There was nothing to say until there was something to do." Aldo studied her. Behind him, the others had arranged themselves in a loose arc, not formally, not like men taking positions, but organically, the way people cluster around a fire in the cold. Something about the arrangement bothered the back of her mind, and she didn't let it show. "The Brantley ceasefire," Aldo said, 2017, Northern Territory dispute, 3 families involved. 2 weeks from open war." He paused. "That was you." It wasn't a question either. "Damien presented the terms," Vivienne said carefully. "Damien read the terms you wrote. He flew to the meeting in a suit you picked because you knew Brantley's people respected presentation. He shook hands with men who'd already decided to accept because you'd spent 6 weeks building the back channels that made acceptance feel like their idea. Aldo's expression hadn't changed. "I'm old. I'm not stupid." Vivienne was quiet. "The Hargrove debt," Dmitry Volkov said from behind Aldo, his accent still carrying the ghost of somewhere colder. When Hargrove's son came to collect what his father was owed and Damien was ready to go to war over a shipping dispute that wasn't worth the body count, someone reached Hargrove's son directly and restructured the agreement. 4 families avoided a conflict that would have cost all of them. He paused. Damien took the credit. "Damien is my husband," Vivienne said. "Was," Marcus Hale said. He said it without inflection, like a man noting the weather. The word landed. Vivienne didn't react to it, but she felt it, felt the weight of what it implied about how quickly the men around her had already recalibrated. These were people who made decisions in real time, who couldn't afford nostalgia or lag. Damien had made a move. They were already accounting for the implications. "We're not here to take sides in a marriage," Rafael Castellano said. He was the older of the brothers, the more cautious one, the one who always looked for the angle before he spoke. "We're here because what happened in that room tonight changes the math on everything." "The math was always the same," Vivienne said. "No," Rafael said. "The math was stable because you were in the room. Now you're not." He glanced at his brother, something passing between them. "Within 72 hours, every arrangement that runs through Vescari channels is going to need to be renegotiated or it won't hold. Half of those arrangements exist because the other parties trust your word, not Damien's name. You understand what I'm saying?" Vivienne understood. She'd understood it for years. Had spent years, in fact, making sure that the infrastructure she'd built was invisible enough that Damien never felt threatened by it, and durable enough that it would matter when it was tested. She hadn't planned for this exact scenario, but she'd known, in the way that people who pay close attention always know, that the thing she'd built was too valuable to stay invisible forever. She just hadn't anticipated that Damien would be the one to expose it. "What are you asking me?" she said. It was Aldo who answered. "Nothing tonight. Tonight we're just standing on a lawn." He turned his gaze briefly toward the compound's lit windows, then back to her. "But there are conversations that need to happen, not as Damien's wife, as yourself." He left it there. The 7 men filtered back toward the vehicles that had brought them, unhurried, unspeaking, leaving her standing in the dark with the smell of wet earth and the distant sound of the compound's security detail doing their rounds along the perimeter. Vivienne stood there for a long time. She thought about the look on Damien's face when he'd made his announcement, that precise, controlled confidence, so certain he'd resolved something. She thought about Celeste Rowan in her expensive clothes, waiting somewhere inside the compound right now, probably already rehearsing the version of herself she planned to present to the council. She thought about 11 years of meetings and phone calls and carefully worded agreements and middle-of-the-night conversations with men who called her because they trusted her to find the path through when there wasn't an obvious one. She thought about what Damien had actually done tonight. Not to her marriage, to the architecture she'd spent 14 years constructing out of trust and patience and the understanding that power, real power, wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself in council chambers. It didn't strip people of titles or wave its hand at rooms full of frightened men. It waited. Inside the compound, Damien was pouring himself a drink. The council chamber had emptied faster than he'd expected. He'd anticipated some resistance, some formal objection from Ferrante or the Castellanos, some procedural pushback that he'd have to navigate. Instead, they'd simply left, one after another, following the old man out like ducks in a row. And now Damien was standing in the same room where his father had once made decisions that moved markets and ended careers, and the room felt cavernous and strange. Celeste came in through the side door. She was beautiful in a way that took effort. Not the kind of beauty that existed in the bones, but the kind that was constructed with precision and maintained with discipline. And Damien had always found that more attractive than the alternative. Effort meant intention. Intention meant control. "They left," she said. "They'll come back." "Damien." "They'll come back," he repeated, with the particular flatness that meant he wasn't interested in being argued with. He drank. The whiskey was good. His father's reserve, bottles he'd been saving for 20 years. And it hit the back of his throat with a warmth that was supposed to be steadying and wasn't. Ferrante's playing games. He wants me to think I've made a mistake. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Have you? He looked at her. She held his gaze steadily. She was good at that, better than most people, comfortable with the particular discomfort of his attention in ways that had drawn him to her in the first place. Vivienne ran communications, he said, handled some negotiations. That's a function. Functions can be replaced. They didn't leave because of a function. He turned away. Get Marchetti on the phone. I want the encrypted relay checked. There were some delays last month I never got a full explanation for. It's almost midnight. Then he'll be awake when you call him. He set down the glass. And get me the Hargrove file. The current one, not the summary. Celeste picked up her phone. She was already dialing when something crossed her face. A flicker of something she suppressed before it became readable. Line's dead, she said. Damien turned. What? The relay. She looked up from the phone. It's not connecting. He crossed the room and took the handset from her and tried the line himself. Nothing. Not static, not a busy signal. Nothing. The flat, featureless silence of a connection that no longer existed. He tried 2 more numbers. Same result. He went to the compound's main communications panel, a system he'd had installed 3 years ago, redundant and encrypted, the kind of infrastructure that was supposed to be impervious to interruption, and he ran the diagnostic. Every channel registered as active. Every channel produced nothing. Something moved through him that wasn't quite fear. He wouldn't have called it fear. He'd have called it the recognition, arriving late and unwelcome, that something had happened that he didn't fully understand. He thought about Vivienne's face when she'd looked at him across the council table. That faint, unreadable smile. The smoothing of her dress with both hands, unhurried, completely composed. The smile hadn't been for him, he realized now. It had been for herself. He went to the window. The lawn was empty. The vehicles that had carried the 7 families were gone, somewhere out there in the dark, in cars moving quietly down roads he knew, and roads he didn't. The most powerful men in organized crime were making phone calls of their own. He was still standing at the window when his head of security came in. Mr. Viscari? The man's face was carefully neutral, which meant the news was bad. We've lost contact with the Brennan Street operation, and the warehouse on the river. He paused. There's a fire. Damien turned slowly. How bad? We don't know yet. We're trying to reach the crew, but... Another pause. The communications issue. Damien looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back out the window at the dark lawn, at the place where 7 men had stood and then departed without a word about when they planned to return. Find Vivienne, he said. His head of security hesitated. Sir? Find her. I want to know where she is. The man left. Damien turned back to the window. In the glass, his own reflection looked back at him. 40 acres of darkness behind it. A fire somewhere on a river he couldn't see. 7 families moving through the night toward conversations he wasn't part of. And an encrypted communication system that had gone silent in the same hour his wife had walked out of the room where he'd tried to make her disappear. He'd been so certain that silence was the same thing as surrender. The whiskey glass was still on the table. He didn't pick it up. Outside, the first of what would be many bad nights had already begun. Vivienne was in the car when her phone rang. Not the phone Damien's people had set up for her. The other one, older, smaller, a number known to perhaps 15 people in the world, none of them connected to the Viscari Syndicate by anything Damien had ever been aware of. She'd been carrying it for 9 years. She'd hoped, in the way that people hope for things they don't quite believe in, that she'd never need to use it for anything serious. She looked at the screen. The number was a string of digits she'd memorized rather than saved. She answered. He did it, said the voice on the other end. A woman's voice, clipped, European accent worn smooth by years in American cities. I'm watching the compound's network traffic. Everything started dropping about 40 minutes ago. I know, Vivienne said. The Hargrove people are already making calls. They're not going to wait. They'll treat the silence as a default and start repositioning. A pause. Vivienne, This is what we talked about. This is the moment. I know, she said again. The question is whether you're ready to stop being someone's wife and start being... I know what the question is. She looked out the car window at the dark countryside sliding past. The driver was one of her own, had been, in a sense, for years, one of 3 people on the compound staff who understood that there were 2 sets of instructions and knew which one to follow when it mattered. Tell the others to hold. Nothing moves until I say. Aldo Ferrante's already reached out. I know. If you make him wait too long, he'll wait, Vivienne said. He's been waiting for someone to make this make sense for 30 years. He can wait another 12 hours. She paused. How's the Eastern Relay? A brief silence. Functional. On our end. Good. Keep it that way. She looked down at her own hands in her lap. Steady, no tremor. The hands of a woman who had spent a long time preparing for a night that felt, even now, slightly unreal. And tell Marchetti he should stop picking up calls from the compound. Damien's going to try to reach him. He shouldn't make it easy. Marchetti's been on our side for 6 years. I know, but Damien doesn't know that yet, and I need him to spend a few more hours believing he does. She ended the call. The car moved through the dark. Somewhere behind her, a man who had spent 11 years believing that her quietness meant she had nothing to say was standing at a window and beginning, for the first time, to understand what the room felt like without her in it. Vivienne closed her eyes. She thought about the moment she'd made the decision. Not tonight, not in the council chamber, but years ago, in a hallway in this same compound, listening through a partially open door to a conversation between Damien and his then underboss about asset consolidation. Hearing her own name used in a context that made her understand, with the cold clarity of something finally confirmed rather than suspected, exactly what she was to the man she'd married. A function. Those were his words. Something useful that didn't need to understand its own utility. She'd walked away from that door and she'd gone upstairs and she'd sat in the room that was supposed to be hers, and she'd spent a very long time deciding who she was going to be. Not in anger. Anger was loud, and loud things broke against silence without leaving a mark. In calculation. In the slow, patient work of someone who understood that the only revenge worth having was the kind that restructured reality rather than just satisfying a feeling. The car turned onto a road she knew. 20 minutes from the safe house she'd established through a name that wasn't hers, in a county where the Viscari name meant nothing. Her phone buzzed. A message, 3 words, from a number she recognized as Aldo Ferrante's. When you're ready. She put the phone in her pocket. Ready, she thought, was a complicated word. She'd been ready for years. What she was now was something else. Something that didn't have a name yet. Something that lived in the space between the woman who'd walked out of that council room and the woman who was going to walk into the next one. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Everything okay? Pull over for a minute, she said. He did. They sat on the shoulder of a rural road with the engine idling and the dark pressing in on both sides and the distant glow of a city somewhere to the south. Vivienne reached into her bag and found the small leather notebook she'd been carrying for 11 years. She'd started it the night after the hallway. Names, dates, agreements, the invisible architecture of everything she'd built, and everything she'd overheard, and everything she'd been given access to because no one had thought it worth protecting from her. It was 40 pages of the most dangerous document in organized crime, written in a shorthand only she could read. She held it in both hands. Then she made 3 phone calls. The first was to Eduardo Benitez, who answered on the second ring and said nothing after her opening words except, "Tell me where," she said. The second was to Sung-Jin Park, who listened to her in total silence for 90 seconds, and then said, in his precise, considered way, "The container logistics will take 4 days to reroute. I'll start tonight." The third was to a number she'd never called before, a number she'd been given 8 years ago by a federal prosecutor named Elise Varner during a conversation that had never officially happened, in a coffee shop in a city neither of them lived in, with the understanding that it would be used exactly once and exactly when it mattered. The line rang twice. A man answered. Not Varner. Someone younger. Someone awake at this hour, which told her they'd been expecting contact. "This is Vivienne Ashcroft," she said. Tell Varner I'm ready to discuss the framework we talked about. All of it. A pause. Then, she'll call you back within the hour. Vivienne ended the call. She put the notebook back in her bag. She looked out through the windshield at the dark road ahead, at the place where the headlights ended and the world became something else entirely. Drive, she said. The car pulled back onto the road. Behind her, somewhere back in the compound, Damien's encrypted communications were silent. His riverside warehouse was burning, and the 7 families were in motion. Tomorrow, there would be more fires. Not the kind that left ash, but the kind that left nothing at all, that rewrote the map so completely that the people navigating by the old one wouldn't understand what had happened until they were already lost. She hadn't started this, but she had spent 11 years making sure that when it started, she'd be the only one who knew where all the roads led. The car moved through the dark, and somewhere in the distance, something that had been building for a very long time began, at last, to arrive. The safe house smelled like old wood and heating oil, and the particular kind of quiet that exists in places where no one is supposed to be. Vivienne had bought it through a name that wasn't hers, in a county that had no reason to connect her to anything, paid for in cash drawn from accounts that predated her marriage by 4 years. She'd furnished it minimally. A table, 4 chairs, a couch that had seen better decades, a kitchen with enough in the cabinets to last a week if necessary. No art on the walls. No softness anywhere. She hadn't built it to be comfortable. She'd built it to be functional, and she'd built it the way she built everything, quietly, without announcing the intention, in the spaces between the things people were watching. She arrived at 2 a.m. Eduardo Benitez was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he'd made from the supplies she kept in the cabinet above the sink. He was 61 years old, and he looked like a man who'd spent that time doing things that didn't photograph well, broad through the shoulders, gray at the temples, with a stillness about him that wasn't peace but something more like the suspension of violence, the way a compressed spring is still. The leg he favored gave a small tell when he rose to greet her, and he didn't bother hiding it. "You look tired," he said. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't." He pulled out a chair across from his own. "Sit down." She sat. He poured a second cup without asking and set it in front of her and returned to his own chair, and they looked at each other across the table the way people look at each other when there's too much to say and not enough certainty about where to start. "How bad is it?" she asked. "The warehouse on the river is gone. Accelerant. Professional, not opportunistic. Someone planned it." He turned his cup slowly in both hands. "Brennan Street went dark about an hour before the fire. My guess is communications were cut first and then they moved on the physical assets. Sequential, methodical. Not one of the 7 families. No, the families pull back. They don't attack. This is someone who was waiting for a window." He paused. "Someone who knew the window was coming." Vivienne absorbed that. "How long have they been watching?" "Long enough to know your removal was the trigger they needed." He said it without softness, because Eduardo Benitez had never learned to soften things, and she didn't want him to. "The question isn't how long. The question is how many of them there are, and whether last night was the opening move or the whole game." "It's the opening move." "You sure?" "They're not trying to win tonight. They're trying to make sure Damien can't win at all." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. It was hot enough to hurt slightly, and she held it anyway. If they wanted to destroy the Syndicate outright, they'd go after the legal infrastructure first. The holding companies, the real estate, the licensed businesses. They haven't touched those yet. "Yet," Benitez said. "Yet," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a car passed on the county road. Just headlights sweeping briefly across the kitchen window, and then gone. "Damien's going to reach out to you," Benitez said. "I know." "When he does, I know," she said again, and the repetition carried enough weight that he stopped. She looked at the table. "He's going to reach out because he's scared, and because he's spent 11 years believing that I exist to solve problems he creates. He's going to call me, and he's going to frame it as reconciliation, and what he's actually going to mean is that he needs the machine I built, and he'd like it back, please, if it's not too much trouble." She paused. "And I'm going to have to decide what I want to do with that." Benitez looked at her steadily. What do you want to do with it? I want to stop the bleeding first. She set down the cup. Park's rerouting the container logistics starting tonight. Ferrante's waiting on a call. I need you to reach the Hargrove people before they default. They won't honor the agreement if they think Vescari's in freefall, but they'll honor it if I'm the one asking them to. That's a big ask. Hargrove's son doesn't have the same history with you that his father did. His father's history is exactly what I'm going to use. She met his eyes. Can you get me a meeting? Benitez thought about it for 3 seconds, which was how he thought about everything. Compressed, efficient, no wasted motion even in his consideration. 48 hours. I need 24. Then you're going to need to give me something to offer them. Tell them I'm prepared to restructure the northern shipping terms, the ones Damien renegotiated 2 years ago that Hargrove Jr. has been grinding his teeth over ever since. She watched Benitez's expression shift slightly. Not surprise exactly, more the recalibration of someone who'd thought they knew the dimensions of a room and just discovered another wall. He got a worse deal than his father had, and he knows it, and I knew it when it happened, and I didn't say anything because it wasn't the right moment. And now it is. Now it's all I have to offer him that he actually wants. She stood. I'm going to sleep for 3 hours. Wake me at 5. He nodded. She was at the doorway when he spoke again. Vivienne. She turned. He was still at the table, cup in both hands, the kitchen light making his face look older than it was. Whatever he does next, Damien, don't underestimate how far wrong it can go before he admits it's wrong. I never underestimated him, she said. That was always the problem. She went to the back room and lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling in the dark and didn't sleep for 2 of the 3 hours she'd given herself. Damien didn't sleep at all. By 3 in the morning, the compound had the particular electric quality of a place where everyone was awake and no one was saying what they were thinking. His head of security, a man named Rourke, who had worked for his father before him and whose loyalty Damien had never once questioned because it had never once given him reason to, was running diagnostics on the communication system for the 4th time and getting the same results. Active channels. No traffic. Like shouting into a room and hearing your own voice come back wrong. Celeste had gone upstairs around midnight. He hadn't asked her to, and she hadn't asked permission. She'd simply looked at him for a long moment with something in her eyes that might have been uncertainty, and then she'd taken her glass of wine and gone, heels on the marble, and the sound had faded, and now he was alone in the room where the council met, and he was thinking about the sequence of things. The communications had failed first. Then the warehouse. Then Brennan Street had gone dark. Not randomly, not simultaneously. In order. Like a person working through a checklist they'd had time to prepare. He thought about Vivienne leaving the room. The smoothing of her dress. The smile that had given him nothing. He picked up the landline, the one that ran through the compound's physical infrastructure rather than the encrypted digital relay, and he called the number for his operations contact in the city. The line connected. He felt a brief, disproportionate relief. Then the contact picked up, and Damien said his name, and there was a pause on the other end that lasted just a half-second too long. Mr. Vescari, I can't talk right now. Excuse me? I'm sorry. The voice was careful, clipped, like a man speaking with someone else in the room. I'll have to call you back. The line went dead. Damien stood with the receiver in his hand. He put it down slowly. He tried 2 more contacts. The first didn't answer. The second answered and was courteous and specific and told him, in language that was professionally apologetic rather than hostile, that pending clarification of the current situation, they were pausing all active transactions. Pending clarification. Damien went to find Rourke. He found him in the compound's operations center, a room in the basement that smelled like electronics and recycled air, with 3 monitors running feeds from the perimeter cameras, and a 4th running the communications diagnostic that kept returning the same useless results. What's actually happening? Damien said. Not the official answer. The real one. Rourke turned from the screens. He was a careful man, Rourke. Careful with words the way some people were careful with money, spending them deliberately and only when necessary. He looked at Damien for a moment, and then he said, The relay isn't broken. What do you mean it's not broken? Nothing's going through. The hardware is functional, the software is functional, the encryption keys are valid. Rourke paused. But the network our relay connects to, the backbone routing that carries our traffic, that's not there anymore. Damien stared at him. Networks don't just disappear. No, Rourke agreed. They don't. So someone pulled it. Someone with access to the underlying infrastructure, yes. Rourke's expression was careful, deliberately neutral. That level of access, it's not something you buy. It's something you build over time. It requires relationships with the people who actually run the physical systems. Who has that kind of access? Rourke was quiet for a moment, just long enough that Damien felt it. Say it, Damien said. There were 3 people with credentials to the auxiliary infrastructure, Rourke said. You, me, and the person who originally negotiated the arrangement with the network providers. He stopped. Damien felt the room change temperature. Vivienne negotiated the relay contracts, he said. His own voice sounded strange to him, flat. She negotiated most of the technical infrastructure contracts, Rourke said, 4 years ago. I assumed you knew the full scope of— Get out, Damien said. Rourke left. Damien stood in the operations center alone, surrounded by screens showing him the perimeter of a compound that was intact, guarded, fully operational, and completely isolated. He thought about 4 years ago. He thought about sitting across from Vivienne at dinner while she mentioned, briefly, between courses, that she'd been working on some communications infrastructure questions and had resolved them. He'd nodded and moved on because that was what he did. She handled things, and he moved on because that was how it had always worked. And he'd understood that to mean she was useful. He hadn't understood that useful and essential were different words. He pulled out his personal phone. He found Vivienne's number, the one he had for her, the compound number, the one she'd always answered within 2 rings. He pressed call. It rang. 4 times, 5, 6, voicemail. He called again, voicemail. He sat down in Rourke's chair and stared at the monitors and tried to think clearly through the thing that was building in his chest that wasn't quite panic because he didn't panic, couldn't afford to panic, had spent his entire adult life constructing himself as someone who didn't panic. But there was something happening that he didn't understand, and the people who should be answering his calls weren't answering them, and the fire on the river was still burning according to the last update he'd gotten, and his wife, who he'd just stripped of authority in front of 7 men, his wife who had walked out of the room without looking back. He called Celeste. She answered on the 2nd ring. She was awake, he could tell immediately. Not drowsy, not the voice of someone pulled from sleep, but alert and slightly careful in the way she'd been since midnight. Tell me something, he said. What do you want to know? When Vivienne's name comes up in your conversations with people, he stopped, reorganized. How do they talk about her? A pause. Longer than he expected. Carefully, Celeste said. What does that mean? It means they're careful. Another pause. Damien, there are people in your network who— I've been in these meetings for 3 months now, and there are people who look at me and answer questions and then ask for Vivienne, specifically, by name. Not to be rude, but because they— Because what? Because she's the one they made their agreements with, Celeste said quietly. I didn't know how to tell you. He ended the call. He sat very still for a moment. Then he stood and went upstairs and poured himself a drink he didn't touch, and stood at the window and watched the dark lawn and thought about a hallway years ago in a different building. Watching Vivienne on the phone, thinking she was handling something minor, some domestic logistics, some small detail of the compound's operations, not paying enough attention to hear what she was actually saying because she was Vivienne. She handled things. That was what she did, and he had never once asked what the things were. He'd been so certain that the quietest person in the room was the least powerful one. At 5 in the morning, Benitez woke Vivienne with a knock on the doorframe. She was already sitting up. Ferrante wants a meeting, he said. This morning. He's suggesting the Marchetti property in Dutchess County. Tell him noon. He said 10. Tell him I said noon. She stood, smoothed her clothes from yesterday that she'd slept in, and went to the kitchen. Benitez had made more coffee. She poured a cup and stood at the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the gray pre-dawn, the fields flat and still, the tree line dark. What else? Volkov's been calling. He hasn't left a message. He calls and hangs up after 2 rings. He's checking whether the number still works. Vivienne drank. He'll leave a message when he's ready. Don't reach out first. The Castellano brothers want to know about the port operations. They have a convoy scheduled for day after tomorrow, and they're not sure whether... Tell them to hold the convoy. 24 hours maximum, then I'll have an answer for them. She set down the cup. What about the South? Benitez was quiet for a moment. That's the part I've been waiting to tell you. He moved to the table, pulled out his phone, set it face up between them. On the screen was a photograph. Grainy, clearly taken through a long lens, the kind of image that required patience and the right equipment. It showed a parking structure. 3 men in conversation beside a dark sedan. She recognized none of the faces immediately, but she recognized the parking structure. She'd been in it twice, for meetings that had never officially occurred. Who are they? She said. Left one is Greer, Anton Greer. He ran the consortium that went under after the federal action in 2019, the one that was supposed to fold and apparently didn't. Benitez tapped the screen. Middle is someone we haven't identified yet. Right one is a man named Castello. Not our Castellanos, different family, Gulf Coast, old money from operations that moved north after Katrina. He paused. This was taken 3 days ago. Vivienne looked at the image. Where? 40 miles from the compound. She put the coffee cup down very precisely on the counter. They were already positioned, she said, before the council meeting, before any of last night. They were already there. Benitez's voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath it. Not fear. He wasn't built for fear, but something adjacent to it. The serious attention of a man recalibrating threat level. This wasn't reactive, Vivienne. They weren't watching to see what Damien would do and then moving. They knew what he was going to do. Because someone told them, she said. Someone inside. They looked at each other across the kitchen. The warehouse, she said slowly. The communications. Brennan Street. All 3 were hit before the council meeting ended. Before Damien even made his announcement. The announcement was the cover, Benitez said. Whatever was going to happen, the power shift, the confusion, the breakdown in structure, they didn't need to cause it. They just needed to have their assets in position for when it happened naturally. He paused. Someone gave them the timeline. Someone who knew the meeting was planned. Who knew the meeting was planned? Vivienne thought. The council meetings were not widely advertised. They were scheduled through back channels, communicated through trusted intermediaries, protected by the understanding that their location and timing were the most sensitive information in the organization. The people who had advanced knowledge could be counted on 2 hands, and most of them had been in the room last night. Run the list, she said. Everyone with meeting access. Cross-reference against any contact with Gulf Coast operations in the past 8 months. That's going to take time I'm not sure we have. Then start now. She moved toward the door. I need to make calls. Don't interrupt me for 40 minutes unless the building is on fire. She went to the back room and closed the door and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and opened the phone that wasn't her Vescari phone and started working through a sequence of numbers she'd memorized rather than saved. The conversations were short. She was good at short, at getting to the center of a thing without circling it, without the social softening that most people used to make hard information easier to deliver. She didn't have time for softening. She spoke to 4 people in 20 minutes, and when she was done, she had a clearer picture of the overnight damage than she'd had when she woke up, and the picture was not good. 3 independent brokers who'd worked with Vescari operations had already shifted their active contracts to holding status. 2 of them had been contacted overnight by parties she didn't recognize, offering alternative arrangements. The speed of that, someone had been ready with counteroffers before the sun rose, confirmed what Benitez had said. This wasn't improvisation. This was the execution of a plan that had been ready and waiting. She was still sitting on the edge of the bed when her phone rang. The number on the screen was the one she recognized as Damien's personal cell. Not the compound line, not the relay. His private number, the one he used when he didn't want Rourke or anyone else to know who he was calling. She looked at it for a long moment. It kept ringing. She thought about what she'd told Benitez last night. He's going to reach out because he's scared. He's going to call and frame it as reconciliation. And what he actually means is he wants the machine back. She also thought about what she hadn't said out loud, the part she'd kept for herself in the 2 hours she'd spent staring at the ceiling, that the machine, as Damien had always thought of it, wasn't a machine at all. It was a set of relationships built on a version of herself that she'd spent 14 years constructing. You couldn't hand that to someone else. You couldn't transfer it. It lived in the specific history between her and the people who trusted her, and that history couldn't be inherited by Celeste Rowan or anyone else, any more than you could inherit a scar. The phone was still ringing. She answered it. Silence on the other end. Not dead silence. She could hear him breathing, the slightly elevated quality of someone who'd been awake all night and whose body was starting to register it. "Vivienne," he said. "Damien." Another silence. She waited. She had learned over 14 years that silence was almost always more useful than words, and she had learned it from the particular education of being in a room with powerful men who expected her to fill quiet space and discovering that the ones who waited longest usually got the most. "There are things happening," he said finally. "Things I need to understand the scope of—" He stopped. She could hear him choosing words and rejecting them. "I need you to come back. To the compound." "Yes." "To do what, Damien?" "To help me figure out what the hell is going on." The control in his voice was beginning to show its edges. Not breaking, not yet, but the smoothness was gone, and what was underneath was raw and less certain. "The communications are down, and I can't reach Marchetti, and there was a fire last night, and I think someone's been waiting for—" "I know," she said. A beat. "You know." "I knew before you did, by several hours." She kept her voice even. "The people who moved on the warehouse last night were positioned in the area 3 days ago, before the council meeting, before you made your announcement." Pause. "Someone gave them the meeting timeline." His silence this time was different. She could feel the quality of it change through the phone. The particular texture of someone absorbing information that is simultaneously new and confirming something they didn't want confirmed. "Inside," he said. It wasn't a question. "Inside," she said. Another silence. When he spoke again, the rawness was more pronounced and he wasn't entirely controlling it. "I need you." "No." She said it quietly, but without hesitation. "You don't need me to come back to the compound. You need to understand something first." "What?" "I'm not Celeste." She paused. "I was never a function you could reassign. The people who've been holding this together for the past 14 years, they weren't doing it because of the Viscari name. They were doing it because of me. And that doesn't transfer." She paused again. "You can't fix what happened last night by asking me to come home." The silence stretched. "Then what do I do?" he said. And there it was. The thing under all of it, the thing she'd heard building all night through the sequence of calls and fires and dead relay lines. Not the dawn of a criminal empire. Something much older and more basic than that. A man who'd built an identity out of certainty and was standing in a room where certainty had stopped working. "Don't make any more moves," she said. "Not until you hear from me. Don't reach out to the families. Don't try to renegotiate anything. Don't call in favors. Don't send people into the field. Every move you make right now without the right information will make it worse. And I'll be in contact," she said, "when I have something to tell you." She ended the call. She sat on the edge of the bed for another minute. Then she went back to the kitchen where Benitez was at the table with his phone and 3 pages of handwritten notes spread out in front of him. And she looked at his face, and she could tell before he said a word that he'd found something. "The cross-reference," she said. "What did you find?" He looked up. His expression was the one he wore when the information was worse than expected, which on Benitez was nearly unreadable. A slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the jaw that was different from his usual stillness. "I found a name," he said. "Whose?" He told her. And the thing that moved through Vivienne in the moment she heard, it wasn't anger. It wasn't surprise. It was something colder and more specific. The recognition of a shape she'd almost seen before. something she'd felt at the edge of her understanding for months, and hadn't let herself follow to its conclusion because the conclusion required her to believe that the name Benitez said was Rourke. Vivienne stood in the kitchen of the safe house and heard it and felt the specific weight of it settle into her chest like something dropped from a height. Not a collapse, more like a recalibration. The sensation of a structure you'd believed was solid, revealing a load-bearing wall that was never where you thought it was. Rourke. She'd known him for 11 years. He'd worked for Damien's father before that, for 6 years prior, which meant he'd been inside the organization longer than she had, longer than almost anyone still active. He was the kind of man who became invisible through sheer consistency, always present, never dramatic, the person in every room who looked like furniture until you needed him, and then he was exactly where he was supposed to be. She'd handed him information, not carelessly. She was never careless, but with the reasonable trust of someone who'd spent a decade watching a man do his job without deviation and had concluded the watching was enough. Apparently it wasn't. "How deep?" she said. Benitez looked at his notes. Gulf Coast contact, name of Sutter, made 3 wire transfers over the past 8 months to an account in the Caymans. Account traces back through 2 shells to a holding company registered in Delaware, dissolved 6 months ago, reformed under a different name. He paused. The Delaware company's registered agent is the same firm Rourke used for a personal real estate transaction in 2021. That's circumstantial. On its own, yes. Benitez turned a page. But Rourke also made 2 calls from the compound's landline, not the relay, the physical landline, probably because he knew the relay logs were accessible to you, to a number registered to a logistics firm in Baltimore that I can connect to Greer's consortium in 4 steps. He looked up. 4 steps is not many steps. No, Vivienne said. It isn't. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down and looked at the notes without touching them, the way she looked at things when she was thinking rather than reading, using the page as a surface for her focus rather than a source of information. He was at the council meeting, she said. Standing security in the corridor, standard position. He knew the timeline, he knew the meeting was scheduled, he knew the agenda, he knew... She stopped. She was working through it in real time, and she made herself slow down because the instinct when something like this landed was to move fast, to act on the anger and the vertigo of it, and fast movement on bad information was how situations became catastrophic. He would have known about my removal before I did. Damien told him the plan 2 days prior, Benitez said. I found that in the compound's internal log. A private meeting, 90 minutes, Damien and Rourke. No other attendees noted. Vivienne was quiet. She thought about Rourke's face in the operations center when he'd told Damien that the relay wasn't broken. That careful, neutral expression she'd read as professionalism and now understood was something else entirely. He'd been watching Damien discover the shape of his own trap. He'd been present for it. He'd delivered the information that would point Damien toward her and then stepped back and let it work. The warehouse fire. Brennan Street. The communications blackout. All of it had been coordinated using intelligence that only someone inside the compound could have provided. Not just the meeting timeline, the physical locations of operations, the structure of the relay system, the identity of the key contacts whose defection would cause maximum disruption. He gave them the relay architecture, she said. It wasn't a question. Has to be. No one outside could have hit it that cleanly without a map. Which means they didn't just know when to move. They knew exactly where to cut. She pressed 2 fingers against her mouth and thought, how long have you known Rourke? Long enough. That's not an answer. Long enough to know he's not the type to do this for money alone, Benitez said. He said it carefully, the way he said things when the care itself was part of the information. Rourke has money. He's had money for years. Damien's father paid him well, and Damien pays him better. This is something else. What's something else? I don't know yet. He paused. But I think you should consider the possibility that Rourke isn't working for Greer's coalition. I think he might be working alongside them. Different principle, shared objective. Vivienne looked at him. You think someone recruited him specifically? I think someone identified the one person inside the compound who had enough access and enough history to make this work, and then spent a very long time making him an offer he eventually decided was worth taking. He folded his hands on the table. That's not Greer. Greer doesn't have the patience for that kind of recruitment. This is someone else's architecture. Who? That's what I don't know. Vivienne sat back. The pre-dawn gray outside the window had shifted toward something lighter. Not sunrise yet, but the suggestion of it, the sky deciding to change. She was aware of her own exhaustion in a distant clinical way, the kind of awareness that doesn't translate into feeling because the body has decided it doesn't have the luxury. I need to talk to Rourke, she said. Benitez was very still. That's a complicated idea. I know. If he knows we've identified him, he doesn't know yet, but he will within hours because Damien is going to keep pushing on the communications failure, and eventually he'll find the same thread we found and he'll pull it, and Rourke will know the timeline is closing. She looked at Benitez. I need to talk to him before that happens, before he disappears. Or before he does something worse than disappear. She held his gaze. Can you get to him without Damien knowing? Benitez thought for a moment. There's a window. Rourke does a compound perimeter check every morning at 6 alone, habit going back years. There's a segment of the east fence where the cameras have a coverage gap. He knows about it. He reported it 3 years ago. Damien put it on a repair list that never got completed. He paused. I could be there. Not you, Vivienne said. Me. The silence that followed had a specific quality she recognized. The silence of someone deciding whether to argue and concluding that the argument was already lost. He might be armed, Benitez said. He's always armed. So was everyone I've ever talked to. She stood. Get me to the east fence by 5:50. What? The morning was cold in the specific way of upstate autumn, the kind of cold that came with clarity and no sympathy. And Vivienne stood inside the tree line 40 feet from the compound's east perimeter with the damp grass soaking through the leather of her shoes and waited. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps on gravel, measured, unhurried, the walk of a man doing a task he'd done so many times it required no active thought. Rourke came around the corner of the fence line in his dark coat, hands in his pockets, and he was 20 feet away before he stopped. He saw her. Neither of them moved for a long moment. His face did something in those first 2 seconds that she filed carefully away. Not surprise exactly, more the complex, rapid reorganization of a person confronting an outcome they'd considered possible but hadn't assigned high probability to. He recovered fast. She'd expected that. Mrs. Viscari, he said. His voice was exactly what it always was. That was the thing about Rourke. Even now, even here, he sounded like himself. Walk with me, she said. I'm not asking. She held his gaze. And I'm alone. I want you to know that. No one's waiting. This is just us. He looked at her for another moment. Then he came through the gap in the fence and walked toward her, and they stood in the tree line together in the thin morning light, and she could see his breath in the cold air, and hers. Sutter, she said. The Cayman's account. The Delaware Holding Company. She watched his face. I know about the calls from the landline. Something moved through his expression and was controlled before it became anything identifiable. He looked out at the tree line rather than at her. How long have you known? He said. 2 hours. Damien doesn't know yet. He nodded slowly. Not relief, something more complicated. Like a man taking the measure of a situation and adjusting. What do you want? He said. To understand. No, you don't. He looked at her then. You want the name. I want everything, she said. The name, the structure, the timeline, how deep this goes, and how long it's been going. I want to know who the actual principal is because it's not Greer. Greer doesn't have the architecture for this kind of recruitment. And I want to know what they offered you that was worth burning 11 years. Rourke was quiet for a moment. He looked older in the morning light than he did under the compound's controlled lighting. She could see the lines in his face, the gray that had spread further than she'd noticed before, the particular tiredness of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. You built something here, he said. You know that. Everyone knows that. Even Damien. Even if he only knows it now because he broke it. A pause. But you built it inside a structure that was always going to eat you eventually. That's not an answer. It's context. I don't need context. I need the name. He looked at her steadily. And if I give it to you, then what? You take it to Damien? You negotiate your position back? No, she said. Then what? She held his gaze. I take it somewhere it can actually do something. Something shifted in his expression. Not trust. She wasn't naive enough to expect trust, but a kind of reconsideration, the specific quality of someone who'd made a calculation and was now running it again with new variables. Varner? He said. She kept her face still. The name hit her like cold water, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was exactly the opposite. Elise Varner, the federal prosecutor. The number she'd called last night, the framework conversation they'd had 8 years ago in a coffee shop in a city neither of them lived in. What about Varner? She said carefully. That's who you called last night. He watched her. From your secondary phone, the one you've had for 9 years. He paused. I know about the secondary phone, Vivienne. I've known for 6 years. The morning felt colder than it had a moment ago. Who else knows, she said. The person I work for. He said it without inflection, like a man stating a weather fact. That's been the insurance. If anything happened to me, or if you moved against the operation, that information goes to Damien. She understood immediately what that meant. Damien learning she had a 9-year secret relationship with a federal prosecutor, regardless of context, regardless of what the relationship actually was, would be interpreted one way and one way only. It would make everything she'd built, every alliance, every agreement, look like a setup. It would destroy not just her position, but her credibility with every family that had trusted her. It would confirm exactly the narrative that the coalition needed in order to fracture the 7 families permanently. You've been sitting on that for 6 years, she said. Watching, he said. Waiting. For what? For the right moment. He paused. Turns out the right moment was when Damien handed it to us. She breathed, slow and even. She would not let him see what this was doing to her. The specific vertigo of having a structure you believed was solid reveal a fault line that ran directly beneath your feet. The name, she said. The principle. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. She could see something moving behind his eyes. Not guilt. It was too late for guilt. But something that might have been once, something adjacent to it. Harlan Voss, he said. The name meant nothing to her for half a second. Then it meant everything. Harlan Voss was dead. Had been dead for 7 years. A stroke, sudden, at 68, reported in the trade publications that covered the legitimate side of the businesses that men like the ones she'd spent her life navigating liked to use as insulation. He'd been the silent investor behind 3 of the organizations that had supposedly collapsed in the federal action of 2019. She'd known his name peripherally, had never met him, had understood him, in the vague way you understood background figures, as someone from a previous era who'd retired before she arrived. Voss is dead, she said. Voss faked it, Rourke said. The stroke was real but non-fatal. He spent 8 months in a facility in Switzerland and came out with a new name and a very specific agenda. He paused. He lost everything in 2019. The federal action took it all. Every legitimate cover, every operating structure, 40 years of work. He holds the 7 families responsible. He holds the peace agreements responsible. Because without the peace agreements, the feds couldn't have built a coordinated case across multiple organizations. He let that sit for a moment. He holds you responsible. Specifically. Vivienne stared at him. He believes the ceasefire architecture you built made it possible for federal investigators to map the entire network, Rourke said. Because everyone was talking to everyone through established channels. And those channels, however carefully constructed, created a pattern of relationship that prosecutors could trace. He paused. He's not entirely wrong. That's insane, she said, and then immediately, he's not wrong. The words came out before she'd fully processed them, and then she understood they were true. The architecture she'd built, the back channels, the trusted intermediaries, the carefully structured communication networks designed to prevent conflict, had also, inevitably, created legibility. The same map that allowed the families to talk to each other allowed anyone with sufficient access to see who was talking to whom. She'd known this, abstractly. She'd managed the risk as best she could. She hadn't known that someone had spent 7 years blaming her for it. How many people, she said, in his organization? Enough. He's had 7 years to rebuild, and this time he built it correctly. No centralizing structure, no single point of failure, cells that don't communicate laterally. Rourke's voice was flat, professional, the voice of a man briefing a superior on an enemy's assets. Old habit. She wondered if he was aware of it. He doesn't need to win. He just needs to dismantle enough of what you built that the families turn on each other, which they'll do naturally once the agreements fail. He lets them destroy themselves, and then he moves into the vacuum. Using who? Using whoever survives. Vivienne looked at him. You knew all of this. You've been inside this for 4 years, he said quietly. He approached me 4 years ago. What did he offer you? Rourke looked away. Out at the tree line, at the morning that was fully arriving now, gray and flat. When he looked back, his face had the quality of someone who has reached the far side of a decision they made a long time ago and can see clearly now that it cost more than they'd calculated. He offered me the truth about what happened to my daughter, he said. Vivienne stopped. She knew Rourke had a daughter, had known it for years. Elena, mid-30s, estranged, living somewhere on the West Coast. She'd never heard the full story because Rourke didn't tell full stories, and she hadn't pushed. She filed it now against everything else she knew about him, and felt the specific shape of a manipulation that was so clean and so patient it made her chest tighten. What happened to her? She said. She was involved with someone connected to a Vescari operation in 2014. Things went wrong. His jaw moved. Damien's father handled it the way he handled things. I was told it was an accident. Voss had documentation that it wasn't. He paused. I believed him. Did he? She stopped. Is the documentation real? I don't know anymore. He said it like a man who'd stopped being able to tell the difference. Maybe. Probably. Does it matter? She looked at him for a long moment. The anger she felt was clean and useless. Useless because he'd made his choice 4 years ago, and the shape of everything since had been determined by that choice, and because the thing that had driven him was the specific relentless pain of a parent with an unanswered question, which was the oldest and most effective lever that people who built these kinds of operations knew how to find and how to pull. It matters, she said, but not right now. What happens now? He said. She thought. She thought about the Varner information he'd been holding for 6 years, sitting in the hands of Voss's organization, a loaded weapon aimed at the credibility she'd spent 14 years building. She thought about Voss, alive, in some city she didn't know, working through a structure she couldn't fully map, with 4 years of preparation and an intimate knowledge of her methods because he'd had a man inside her world for all of it. She thought about the 7 families, already unsettled, the Castellano convoy on hold, Songjin Park rerouting logistics in the dark, Ferrante waiting at a property in Dutchess County for a meeting she'd agreed to at noon. She thought about the notebook in her bag, 40 pages of the most dangerous information in organized crime. You're going to tell me everything, she said, every name, every cell you know about, every communication you've had with Voss or anyone in his structure. Every piece of information you pass to them. She held his gaze. And then you're going to stay exactly where you are. You're going to go back through that fence and do your job and act like this conversation didn't happen. And if I don't, then I give Damien your name this morning and you spend whatever time you have left on that. She said it without heat. But if you do, if you give me what I need, then whatever happened to Elena in 2014, I will find out the truth of it, with or without Voss's documentation. She paused. That's not a negotiation. It's the only offer. He looked at her. The morning light was fully there now, flat and honest, and in it she could see him exactly as he was, not the careful, neutral professional of 11 years of compound corridors, but a man who had made a catastrophic choice from a comprehensible place of grief and had been living inside the consequences of it long enough that the inside had started to feel like the only world. There's something you need to know first, he said. Then tell me. The Varner framework, he said it carefully. Your 8-year arrangement. The conversation in the coffee shop. He paused. Voss knows the full structure of it. Not just that the phone exists, the terms, what you offered and what you were offered in return. Another pause. He has a source inside Varner's office. Vivienne felt the floor move. Not metaphorically. The actual ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The cold grass, the tree line, the pale morning, as the full dimension of what she was hearing assembled itself. If Voss had a source inside Varner's office, then the federal framework she'd been building toward for 8 years, the things she'd called last night, the agreement she'd told Varner she was ready to discuss, was already visible to the enemy, which meant that the moment she activated it, Voss would know. And Voss knowing meant Damien knowing within hours. And Damien knowing meant, "He's going to burn you from both sides," Rourke said quietly. That was always the plan. If you went to the families, he'd expose the Varner connection and you'd lose them. If you went to Varner, he'd expose it to Damien and you'd lose everything. He looked at her with something in his face that was almost close to apology. You were going to be the sacrifice either way. Before you did anything, before last night, he paused. He designed the whole operation around the assumption that you would be the one trying to stop it. She stood in the tree line and breathed and let the full shape of it arrive. 7 years. Harlan Voss had spent 7 years constructing a trap around a single person, around her specifically, her methods, her relationships, her parallel architecture, and had waited with extraordinary patience for the trigger event that would make it collapse inward. And the trigger event had been Damien, not something Voss had engineered, something Damien had provided for free, out of ego and impatience, and the fundamental mistake of confusing his wife's silence with her absence. She'd spent 14 years building something in the belief that it was invisible. Voss had spent 7 of those years proving it wasn't. The notebook, she said. Rourke looked at her. Does he know about the notebook? A pause, long enough that she had her answer before he gave it. He knows it exists, Rourke said. He doesn't know where it is. She pressed her fingers against her mouth. Thought. The notebook was the one thing, the one complete record of everything. Names, dates, agreements, the full cartography of 14 years. It was also, she understood now with cold clarity, the one thing Voss needed to complete the picture he was working from. With it, he could reverse engineer every relationship she'd built, identify the points of leverage, and dismantle the remaining structures systematically. Without it, there were gaps in his map. Gaps she could use, but the notebook was also the one thing she could use against him. If she could get it to Varner intact, with the source inside Varner's office identified and isolated first, it became evidence rather than intelligence. It became the thing that could put Voss's rebuilt organization in front of a federal grand jury before he had time to scatter. The problem was she had perhaps 6 hours before Damien found the thread leading to Rourke. And the moment Damien found Rourke, Voss would know his inside man was burned, and he would move. Not the careful, methodical movement of the past 7 years, but the fast, destructive movement of an operation that has decided the endgame has arrived. The source in Varner's office, she said. Do you have a name? Rourke was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she could see him deciding. The visible quality of someone choosing between 2 versions of who they were going to be from this point forward. Kellen, he said. First name. I only ever had the first name. Junior prosecutor, Varner's team, been there 3 years. He paused. That's all I have. It was enough. It was almost enough. If she could get that to Varner directly, not through any channel Voss might be watching, not through the phone, not through any method that created a record, and if Varner could isolate Kellen before the next communication left her office. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. The number was Benitez. She answered. What? His voice was tight in a way she'd heard from him perhaps twice in the years she'd known him. A specific quality of compressed urgency that meant the situation had changed while she wasn't watching it. You need to get out of there, he said. Right now. What happened? Damien found the thread. He found it 20 minutes ago. Rourke's name is already in play, and he's... A pause. He called the Castellano brothers. He's telling them that you orchestrated the communications failure, that you planned this. Another pause. He's saying you're working with the people who hit the warehouse. Vivienne stood in the tree line and felt something settle through her that was past anger and past fear and was something harder and colder than either. She looked at Rourke. He'd heard. She could see in his face that he understood exactly what it meant. Damien, cornered and frightened and wrong about the direction of the threat, doing the thing that cornered and frightened men always did, which was to turn on the person closest to them and make the story simple enough to act on. He was going to burn her with his own people before Voss had to. "The notebook," Rourke said quietly. "Where is it?" She looked at him. "If Damien's people find it before you get it out." "I know," she said. She ended the call with Benitez. She looked at Rourke for one more moment, this man who had betrayed her and was standing in the morning light with the expression of someone who had arrived, too late and at too high a cost, at the understanding that the side he'd chosen was the wrong one. "Go back," she said. "Say nothing. Buy me 4 hours." "He might already know 4 hours," she said. "That's all I need." She turned and walked into the trees and didn't look back, and behind her she heard him move. Back toward the fence, back toward the compound, back toward a situation that had no version where he came out whole. And she was already running the sequence in her head, the order of things, the narrow window between now and the moment Voss decided to accelerate, the specific problem of getting 40 pages of handwritten intelligence to a federal prosecutor through a channel that a dead man's ghost couldn't see. She had the notebook. She had Rourke's partial information. She had 6 hours, maybe less. And she had no allies left inside the structure she'd spent 14 years building, because Damien had just told the 7 families that she was the enemy, and the 7 families, frightened and destabilized and operating on incomplete information in the dark, were going to believe him long enough for it, not the panicked running of someone who had lost control, but the deliberate ground-eating movement of a woman who had calculated the distance between where she was and where she needed to be, and understood that time was now the only currency that mattered. Through the tree line, wet branches catching at her sleeves, the cold air burning in her lungs, the soft ground giving slightly under each step, with a sound that was too loud in the morning quiet. She covered the quarter-mile back to where Benitez had parked in under 4 minutes, and she got into the car before it had fully stopped moving and said one word. "Drive." Benitez drove. She opened her bag and found the notebook and held it in both hands and thought about the sequence. The problem was architectural. Every channel she'd built over 14 years ran through infrastructure that Rourke had had access to, which meant Voss had mapped it, which meant every trusted route was potentially visible. She couldn't use the secondary phone. Voss knew the number. She couldn't go through any of the family contacts. Damien was already talking to them, already building the narrative that turned her into the threat. She couldn't go to Varner through any established channel because Kellen was in the office, and Kellen was Voss's, and anything that touched the official structure would be visible before it landed. She needed something off the map entirely. "Where are we going?" Benitez said. He was doing 70 on a county road that suggested 50, and his eyes hadn't left the mirrors since they'd pulled out. "The city," she said. "That's Damien's territory." "I know." "Vivienne, I know what it is." She looked at him. "I need to get to a woman named Sylvia Crane. She runs a private mediation firm in Midtown. Legitimate business, completely clean, no connection to any of the families. She's also Elise Varner's sister-in-law." She watched Benitez process that. "I need to get the notebook to Varner, and I need to do it through a channel that Voss cannot see. Sylvia is the only person I can think of who connects those two worlds without existing in either of them." "Does Sylvia know who you are?" "She knows I exist. We've never met." She looked back at the road. "We're going to meet today." Benitez was quiet for a moment. She could see him running the risk calculation, could practically watch him build the decision tree, mapping outcomes, assigning probabilities. He'd been doing that for her for years, and he was very good at it, and she'd learned to let him finish before she pushed. "They'll be watching the roads into the city," he said. "Damien's people or Voss's?" "Both, probably, for different reasons." He changed lanes, took a turn that put them heading south on a route she recognized as a secondary approach, longer but less predictable. "I can get you in, but once you're in, if something goes wrong, then something goes wrong." She closed the notebook and put it back in her bag. "How far out is Ferrante's meeting?" "Noon, Dutchess County. You're already going to miss it. Call him. Tell him to give me until 3. He's not going to, Doug. Tell him I have information about Harlan Voss. She held Benitez's gaze for a moment. He'll wait. Benitez made the call. She watched his face while he spoke. 2 minutes. Brief. The kind of conversation where most of the communication happened in the pauses. When he ended it, his expression had the quality of someone who'd expected resistance and hadn't gotten it. He said 2 o'clock, Benitez said. And he said to tell you that the name you just gave him is a name he's heard recently, which means it's already in circulation. He paused. Which means Voss is moving faster than we thought. She felt that land. Voss was surfacing the name, his own name, or something connected to it, which meant he was past the phase of operating in darkness. He was announcing, in the way that people with sufficient power announce things, that the endgame had begun, that the careful 7 years of invisible positioning were over and what came next was going to be visible and fast. How recently? She said. Ferrante didn't say. She thought for 30 seconds. Someone's been shopping the name to the families, giving them a partial story. Enough to destabilize, not enough to clarify, letting them fill in the gaps with fear. She looked out the window at the highway unfolding ahead of them. Which means by the time I get to Ferrante, someone will have already given him a version of this that I have to argue against. She paused. Who does that? Who has the relationships with all 7 families to move information to all of them simultaneously? Benitez didn't answer immediately. Someone who's been in those rooms, she said. Someone they'd take a call from, Benitez said carefully. They looked at each other. Rourke, she said, or someone Rourke gave access to. He kept his eyes on the road. 4 years is a long time to be inside a compound, long enough to build relationships with each family's liaison contacts, long enough that a call from that number gets answered. She pressed the back of her head against the seat and stared at the roof of the car and felt the pieces assembling into a shape that was worse than what she'd had an hour ago. Rourke hadn't just been a passive intelligence source. He'd been an active node, building relationships, establishing credibility with the family's contacts, positioning himself over 4 years as a trusted intermediary so that when the moment came, he could make calls that would be answered and believed, which meant that the story currently reaching all 7 families was coming from a voice they associated with the compound, with authority, with the Vescari Syndicate itself. And the story was that she was the problem. She sat up. How long to the city? 90 minutes if the roads stay clean. Drive faster. The roads didn't stay clean. They hit the first checkpoint. Not law enforcement, just 2 cars parked diagonally across a secondary route that shouldn't have been watched at all. 40 miles outside the city. Benitez saw it with enough lead time to reverse and reroute without contact, but the fact of it told her something she didn't want to know. Voss's people had the secondary approaches covered, not the main highways. Those were too visible, too many cameras, but the routes that someone trying to move quietly would use. Someone who knew those routes existed had given the map to people with enough bodies to cover them. She thought about the 4 years Rourke had spent inside the compound. Every route she'd ever used, every safe approach and secondary exit, filed away and transferred. Options, she said. I know a way in through the river, Benitez said. He said it with the particular flatness of a man describing an option he doesn't like. Freight route goes under the checkpoint coverage. It's slower and it requires a boat I'm not certain is still where I left it. When did you leave it? 8 months ago. Call someone who can confirm. He called. The boat was there. She listened to the half-conversation and thought about Sylvia Crane and how she was going to explain to a woman who ran a legitimate mediation firm in Midtown why she needed her to carry a handwritten notebook to her sister-in-law, the federal prosecutor, through whatever channel Sylvia used to communicate with family members, using no phone Voss's people might have flagged. She was going to have to tell Sylvia enough of the truth to get compliance without telling her so much that Sylvia's instinct for self-preservation kicked in and made her refuse. That was a narrow lane, and she was going to have to walk it perfectly on no sleep and declining time. The boat was a flat-bottomed aluminum thing that smelled like diesel and river mud, and had a 20-horsepower engine that Benitez treated with the careful attention of a man who knows that an engine failure right now is not an inconvenience, but a catastrophe. They came into the city from the water, under a freight bridge, and Benitez left the boat tied to a dock that belonged to a restaurant supply company that had been closed for 2 years, and they went the rest of the way on foot through the loading district until Benitez found a cab that would take them to Midtown without requiring a phone to call. Vivienne's shoes were soaked through. She didn't mention it. Sylvia Crane's office was on the 31st floor of a glass building that had the self-consciously neutral aesthetic of places designed to make conflict feel manageable. Reception area in grays and whites, art on the walls that was expensive and inoffensive, a receptionist who looked at Vivienne's damp shoes and composed expression with equal professionalism and said that Ms. Crane was with a client and could she— "Tell her Vivienne Ashcroft is here," Vivienne said. "Tell her it's about her sister-in-law. Tell her I have 45 minutes and then I have to leave." The receptionist made the call. 30 seconds later, she said Ms. Crane would be right out, and something in the speed of it told Vivienne that Sylvia had been expecting some version of this, or something like it, in the way that people who live adjacent to dangerous worlds develop a kind of ambient readiness for the day that world arrives at their door. Sylvia Crane was 50, compact, with close-cut gray hair, and the eyes of someone who spent her professional life reading people in high-stakes situations and had gotten very good at it. She came out of the inner office and looked at Vivienne with an expression that was carefully, professionally composed, but had something underneath it that was less composed and more alert. "My office," she said. They went in, the door closed. Sylvia didn't offer coffee or a chair. She stood behind her desk and looked at Vivienne and said, "How bad?" "Bad enough that I came here," Vivienne said, "which should tell you something about how bad." "Tell me specifically." So Vivienne told her. Not everything, not the notebook, not the full 14 years, not the shape of the architecture she'd built, or how she'd built it. She told her about Voss, about the source inside Varner's office, about the name Kellen and what it meant, and what it would mean if information continued to move through the official channels. She watched Sylvia's face while she talked, and saw the progression of responses, the initial careful neutrality, the slight tightening when Kellen's name landed, the specific stillness of a woman who was frightened but not for herself. "Elise needs to know this," Sylvia said when Vivienne finished. "Yes. And you can't reach her through normal channels." "No. Because there's a source in her office." "Yes." She paused. "I need you to carry something to her, physically, not electronically, and I need you to tell her to read it alone before she discusses it with anyone in her office, including the people she trusts most." She put the notebook on Sylvia's desk. "I need you to do it today." Sylvia looked at the notebook. She didn't touch it yet, just looked at it the way people looked at objects that they understood were going to change the shape of their day, possibly longer. "If I do this," she said, "and if what you're telling me is accurate, there's a source in her office, and Elise acts on this, and it comes out that it came through me. Your name stays out of it. I'll make sure of that." "You'll make sure." Sylvia looked at her. "You'll forgive me if I'll make sure from someone I've never met, whose shoes are wet, who arrived without an appointment carrying a notebook she won't let me read. You'll forgive me if that's not the most reassuring thing I've heard today." "I know," Vivienne said. "I can't give you better than that right now." They looked at each other. Sylvia picked up the notebook. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, and then she put it in her own bag. A deliberate, decided movement. "I'll call Elise from a payphone. There's one in the lobby of the building across the street. No one uses payphones anymore, which means no one bothers to compromise them." She paused. 30 minutes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me." Sylvia was already moving toward the door. "If this goes wrong, I'm going to be very angry with you." "If this goes wrong," Vivienne said, "you'll have to get in line." Benitez was in the lobby when she came down. One look at his face told her something had happened in the 40 minutes she'd been upstairs. "What?" she said. "Ferrante moved the meeting." He kept his voice low and close. "Not canceled, moved. He's not at the Dutchess County property anymore." He held out his phone. A message, brief, coordinates rather than an address. "He sent this 20 minutes ago." She looked at the coordinates. She didn't recognize the specific location, but she recognized the general area. An industrial district on the outer edge of the Bronx, not far from where the freight routes ran. Not the kind of place an elderly Don chose for a meeting without a reason. "He's been moved," she said. "Or he moved himself because something happened." "I think someone got to the Dutchess County location before us," Benitez said. "I think he found out and relocated." "Voss? Has to be." He pocketed the phone. "Which means the meeting window is shrinking. If they know Ferrante relocated, they'll be looking for the new location." She thought about the 2 o'clock deadline. It was 12:40 now. The industrial district was 30 minutes in good traffic, and traffic was never good. "Let's go," she said. They were at the building's exit when the door opened from outside and a man came in who moved wrong. Not wrong in a way a civilian would notice, but wrong in the specific way that people who had spent time around violence noticed, the too deliberate way of someone controlling their own pace rather than moving naturally. He was mid-40s, generic in the way of people who worked at being unmemorable, and his eyes went to Vivienne before they'd completed a full sweep of the lobby. He'd been looking for her specifically. Benitez put himself between them in a movement so smooth and immediate it was almost gentle. "Inside," he said to Vivienne, without looking at her. "Eduardo. Inside." No heat in it, just the flat, certain tone of someone who had already processed the situation and reached a conclusion about how the next 30 seconds needed to go. She went back toward the elevator banks. Behind her she heard voices. Not shouting, not yet. The low-controlled exchange of two men who were both trying to assess the same situation simultaneously. She reached the elevator and pressed the button and looked back. There were two more men coming through the lobby's secondary entrance. Not one. 3 total. She took the stairs. 31st floor in heels on a staircase that smelled like concrete and recycled air, and she went up 3 floors and came out on 34 and moved to the window at the end of the corridor and looked down at the street and counted. She could see the street-level approach to the building from here. She could see a car she hadn't noticed when they'd arrived, dark, parked against a loading restriction, and she could see a 4th man on the sidewalk who was watching the building's entrance with the particular patient stillness of someone who'd been placed there rather than someone who'd chosen to stop. 4 people. Minimum. Which meant this wasn't improvised. This was a team that had been positioned knowing she was going to be here. Sylvia. She turned and went back to the stairwell and went up rather than down because up was the one direction the men in the lobby hadn't gone, and she was thinking while she moved, thinking about Sylvia, about the notebook currently in Sylvia's bag, about whether they'd already intercepted Sylvia or whether they'd let her go because they didn't know about the notebook. And Sylvia was a civilian who didn't register as a priority target. She reached the roof access door. It was alarmed. She pushed through it anyway because the alarm was a smaller problem than the alternative, and the cold air hit her like a wall and she crossed the roof in the sound of her own footsteps on gravel, and the city spread out around her in every direction, gray and massive and indifferent and full of people who didn't know what was happening and wouldn't. Her phone buzzed. Benitez. She answered. "I'm clear," he said. He was breathing harder than usual. 3 of them. I lost 2 on the 2nd floor and went out a service exit. A pause. "Where are you?" "Roof." "Okay." The particular quality of a man recalibrating without expressing alarm. "There's a connecting walkway between that building and the one to the north. It's used for HVAC maintenance. It'll be unlocked because those things never get locked. Take it. Come out through the north building's freight elevator and exit on 47th. He paused. "I'll be there in 8 minutes. "Sylvia," she said. "I know. I can't reach her. She's not answering. Find her." "I'm trying." Another pause. "Vivienne, if they have the notebook, find her first." She ended the call. The walkway was exactly where Benitez said it would be. A narrow metal bridge, exposed, the city wind hitting her sideways as she crossed it with the buildings dropping away on both sides, and the street far below, and the cold so sharp now she couldn't feel her fingers properly. She got across. She found the freight elevator. She wrote it down with her back against the wall and her hand on the phone and listened to the sound of the building around her. The mechanical sounds, the distant traffic, the hum of systems built to run invisibly and indefinitely. And she thought about Harlan Voss. alive. In some building in some city, watching the pieces of a 7-year plan finally move. She thought about the specific patience of a man who'd decided to destroy not the organization, but the peace. Who'd understood that the structure she'd built was the target, that without it, the 7 families would turn on each other with the reliable savagery of people who'd spent generations learning how, and the wreckage would be complete and irreversible. She thought about what it meant that he'd had 4 years inside the compound through Rourke. She thought about what Rourke had said. You were going to be the sacrifice either way. The freight elevator opened on a loading dock. She walked out into the cold and the noise and the specific anonymity of a midtown side street, and she scanned for Benitez and didn't see him yet. And then her phone rang again, and this time the number was one she didn't recognize. She answered. Miss Ashcroft. A man's voice, older, with the particular unhurried quality of someone who'd spent a long time not needing to rush. I think it's time we spoke directly. She stood on the sidewalk. Voss, she said, I understand you've had a busy morning. No warmth in it, no hostility. The voice of someone discussing a transaction. I also understand you've made some interesting choices about where to put that notebook. She felt her grip tighten on the phone. Sylvia Crane is fine, he said before she could speak. She's sitting in a car 3 blocks from her office. Unharmed, comfortable, somewhat confused. The notebook is still in her bag. A pause. I don't want Sylvia. I don't want the notebook. I want to talk to you. You're talking to me. In person. Another pause. I've spent 7 years building a case that you made a choice, 14 years ago, that cost people like me everything. I'd like to discuss it with you directly before the next phase begins. A pause. 1 hour. I'll send you an address. And if I don't come, then the notebook goes to Damien. Not through Rourke, through channels inside the family that you haven't identified yet, and the information about Varner goes with it. He let that sit. And the Castellano convoy gets hit tonight while everyone is still confused about who's responsible. Another pause. A lot of people have a bad day. A very bad day. The voice didn't change. Or you come and talk to me and we see if there's a version of this that doesn't require all of that. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold. Send the address, she said. It came through in 30 seconds. She memorized it and deleted the message, and was standing there with the phone in her hand when Benitez's car came around the corner and stopped, and she got in. Sylvia? She said. Safe. 3 blocks from her office, in a car. They've got someone with her, but she's not hurt. His jaw was tight. They let me confirm it. They wanted me to confirm it. Because they wanted me to know they have leverage and they're choosing not to use it. She put the address into his phone. Take me here. He looked at it. Vivienne, I know what it is. She looked at him. Park 1 block away. If I'm not out in 90 minutes, get Sylvia to Varner personally. Don't use any phone. Drive her yourself, she paused. And give this to Ferrante. She wrote 6 words on the back of a receipt from her bag. He'll know what it means. Benitez looked at the 6 words. She watched something move through his face. The progression of a man who was very good at assessing situations, arriving at an assessment he didn't like and accepting it anyway, because the alternative was worse. Be careful, he said. It came out rough, slightly compressed. The voice of a man who didn't say that kind of thing easily. I'm always careful, she said. It just doesn't always look like it from the outside. The car moved. The address was a commercial building in the West 40s. Unremarkable. The kind of building that had seen 15 businesses come and go over 30 years, and now housed a mid-level accounting firm and 2 vacant floors, and a property management company whose name appeared nowhere in any public database she'd ever checked. She got out of the car 1 block away and walked the remaining distance on a sidewalk full of ordinary people moving through an ordinary afternoon. And she thought about the notebook in Sylvia's bag, and she thought about Ferrante waiting somewhere in the Bronx, and she thought about Rourke standing in the compound trying to look like himself while the walls closed in. She thought about Damien at his window. She thought about 7 years. She pushed through the building's front door. The lobby was empty except for a man by the elevator who looked at her and pressed the button without saying anything. 4th floor. The elevator opened onto a corridor that had been recently cleared. She could tell by the absence of the things that usually accumulated in unused corridors. And at the end of it, a door stood open, and inside that room, sitting at a plain table with a glass of water and no visible weapon, was a man she'd never seen before who was 73 years old and looked like someone's retired accountant and had spent 7 years building a trap around the specific shape of her life. Harlan Voss looked up when she came in. "Sit down, Miss Ashcroft," he said. She didn't sit. She stood in the doorway and looked at him and took the full measure of what she was looking at. The careful stillness of someone who'd spent years learning not to telegraph, the hands flat on the table, the eyes that were sharp in a face that was working very hard at seeming ordinary. "You look like what you are," she said. "So do you." He gestured at the chair across from him. "Please, we're not going to accomplish anything with you standing in the doorway." She came in. She sat. She put her bag on the floor beside her and kept one hand near it and looked at him across the plain table. "The families think I hit the warehouse," she said. "They think it's possible." He picked up his water. "Uncertainty is almost as useful as certainty. What do you want from this conversation?" He set the water down, looked at her with the specific directness of a man who'd had a long time to decide what he was going to say when this moment arrived. "I want you to understand why," he said. "I know why. You know the outline." He paused. "The piece you built, the architecture, the back channels, the trusted relationships. It created a map. You know this. You admitted it to yourself this morning." He paused again. "That map was used to build a federal case that destroyed 40 years of my life's work. Businesses, relationships, operations that had existed through 3 generations of my family." He said it without heat, without the dramatic edge she'd expected. Just the flat, certain delivery of a man stating facts that he'd had years to process into something he could live with. "I'm not angry at you, I was, but anger is expensive." A pause. "I'm here because you built the thing that did the damage, and I think you're the only person who can dismantle it." She stared at him. "You want me to dismantle the peace agreements. I want you to step away from them." He leaned forward slightly. "Walk away from the families. Take your notebook and take whatever you've been building with Varner and redirect it somewhere that doesn't involve maintaining a structure that benefits the people who benefited from my destruction." His eyes didn't move from hers. "I'm not asking you to destroy anything. I'm asking you to stop rebuilding it. And if I don't, then the Castellano convoy gets hit tonight and I have an alibi that points directly to you, and by tomorrow morning every family in that council believes you've gone to war with them." He said it the same way he'd said everything else, evenly, like weather. "Not because I want that, because it's what the situation produces if we don't find another path." Vivienne looked at this man who had spent 7 years disassembling her life with the patience of someone who'd had nothing left to lose and had decided to make something out of the loss. She looked at the table between them. She thought about 14 years, about the decisions made in the spaces between the things people noticed, about the particular invisible work of building trust in rooms full of men who didn't know what trust actually cost. She thought about Rourke and his daughter and the specific grief that had made him reachable. She thought about Damien at his window. She thought about what she was going to say next, because what she said next was going to determine everything. The convoy, the families, the notebook, Varner, all of it. And she had one shot at it, and she had to make it land exactly right. "You've spent 7 years," she said, "studying how I work." "Yes." "Then you know I don't make decisions in rooms where someone else controls the exits." She held his gaze. "You know I didn't come here to surrender, and you know that if I'd intended to walk away from those families, I'd have done it the night Damien stripped my authority in front of all of them. And I didn't." Voss was still. "I came here to tell you something directly," she said. "The same courtesy you extended to me." She leaned forward. "Rourke is already talking. The Kellen situation inside Varner's office is already being handled. And Ferrante received 6 words from me 20 minutes ago that have put every family on coordinated hold until they hear from me personally." She paused. "You've been watching me build for 14 years. You should have understood what that meant. I don't build things that fall apart when the center gets knocked out. I build things that route around the damage and keep moving. She stood. The convoy won't be hit tonight, she said, because you're not going to do it. Why not? Because you came here to talk. And people who've already decided to burn everything down don't ask for a conversation first. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not defeat, not yet, but the specific recalibration of a man who'd run a model for 7 years and was watching the actual results diverge from the projection. Sit down, he said quietly. The certainty in his voice had shifted, just slightly, just enough. Tell me what you're proposing. She sat back down. Not because he'd asked her to, because she'd chosen to, and the distinction mattered. To her, even if it was invisible to him, even in a room where he controlled the exits and had 3 men in the corridor and 7 years of preparation behind him. The choice was the thing. The choice was always the thing. Here's what I know about you, she said. You lost everything in 2019 and you spent 7 years deciding it was my fault. And maybe it was partially in the way that a road being built is partially responsible for the accident that happens on it. She held his gaze. But what you actually lost, the businesses, the structures, the 40 years, that wasn't because of the peace agreements. That was because the people inside your organization made decisions that created federal exposure, and the peace agreements made that exposure visible. She paused. You've spent 7 years blaming the map for what the drivers did. Voss was quiet. What I'm proposing, she said, is straightforward. You have an organization that's been rebuilt correctly this time, decentralized, resilient, no single point of failure. You have resources and infrastructure and people who've been loyal to you through 7 years of patient work. She paused. And I have something you don't, which is the trust of 7 families who've been holding their breath since yesterday, waiting for someone to tell them what's true. She kept her voice level. You can hit the Castellano convoy tonight and create chaos. Chaos that eventually, probably benefits you. Or you can let me walk out of this room and I'll do something that benefits both of us in ways that outlast whatever you'd get from the convoy. You're offering me legitimacy, he said. Not a question. His voice had the quality of someone who'd heard the word before and had complicated feelings about it. I'm offering you standing, she said. There's a difference. Legitimacy is a story you tell regulators. Standing is something the families recognize. Standing means when your name comes up in a room full of people who make real decisions, it comes up without the weight of 7 years of grievance attached to it. She paused. You said you're not angry anymore. Prove it. Angry people burn things down. People who want something build. The room was very quiet. Outside, the city moved through its afternoon. The distant sound of traffic, the muffled percussion of a building existing in the middle of 10 million other things. None of it penetrated the particular stillness of 2 people at a plain table deciding the shape of what came next. Voss looked at his hands, then he looked at her. The Kellen situation, he said carefully. If you've already moved on that, if Varner isolates him before I can, then you lose your visibility into the federal framework, she said. Yes, that's part of what I'm offering. I close that door and I don't use what I know about your structure to give Varner anything that exposes you directly. She let that land. The notebook stays with me. Why would you protect me? I'm not protecting you. I'm making a decision about what's useful. She looked at him steadily. A dead organization is useless. An organization that's been dismantled by federal action is useless. But an organization that's been operating for 7 years with the right structure, that understands how not to create exposure, that's something the 7 families can work with if it's positioned correctly. She paused. I'm not offering you forgiveness. I'm offering you a transaction. Voss was still for a long moment. She watched him. She was good at watching. Had spent 14 years getting very good at the specific skill of observing a person in the silence after a proposition, reading the quality of their stillness, understanding the difference between someone who was considering and someone who'd already decided and was managing their expression. Voss was considering. Genuinely, which surprised her slightly because she'd expected more resistance, more theater. But he was 73 years old and he'd been carrying the weight of 7 years and a destroyed life and a grief that had calcified into purpose. And purpose was exhausting in a way that anger wasn't, because anger burned clean and purpose just kept going. "The convoy," he said finally, "stands down tonight. And the families. I'll be at a meeting this afternoon. They'll have the full picture by tonight." She paused. "Including the full picture about Rourke, which means they'll understand that the communications failure and the warehouse weren't me, which means the narrative you've been circulating through Rourke's contacts falls apart." She kept her eyes on his. "You lose the chaos either way. This version, you gain something instead." Another silence. "Sylvia Crane," he said, "goes home, tonight, unharmed, and with her involvement in this never surfacing in any context ever." Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone from the table. She hadn't noticed it there, face down, present without being visible. And he made a call that lasted 11 seconds. When he ended it, he set the phone back down and looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was rare enough to register. "She's being driven back to her office now," he said. Vivienne breathed, slow and even, nothing visible. "The notebook," Voss said. "Mine. I want your word that what's in it about my organization. I said the notebook stays with me. That's what it means." She paused. "My word doesn't require your approval of the terms. It just requires that you believe I mean it." "Do you?" "I've spent 14 years building a reputation on meaning what I say," she said. "You spent 7 years studying that. You tell me." He looked at her for another long moment. And then, slowly, Harlan Voss did something she hadn't expected. He almost smiled. Not warmly. Nothing warm had survived the 7 years. But with the specific wry quality of a man who'd spent a very long time expecting one outcome and found himself in a different one. "You're not what I built you to be," he said. "No one ever is," she said. She stood. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door and he didn't stop her. And the men in the corridor moved aside and she went down the corridor and into the elevator and rode it to the lobby and walked out into the cold midtown afternoon and stood on the sidewalk and let herself feel, for exactly 4 seconds, the specific physical sensation of a structure that had been under enormous pressure, suddenly finding that the pressure had shifted. Then she called Benitez. "Get me to Ferrante," she said. "Now, schätze so Saati." The location Ferrante had relocated to was a warehouse in the Bronx that belonged to a trucking company he'd had a silent interest in for 20 years. The kind of place that looked like nothing from the outside and had been quietly modified on the inside into something that could hold a conversation between people who needed to know they weren't being listened to. She arrived at 2:47, 13 minutes late, and walked in through a side door that Benitez held open and found 7 men waiting for her. All 7 families. In a warehouse in the Bronx on a Tuesday afternoon, present because the 6 words she'd sent through Benitez had been enough. The 6 words were, "Harlan Voss is alive. I have proof." Ferrante was at the center of the group. He'd taken no chair, just stood with his arms folded across his wide chest. And when she came in, he looked at her with the expression she'd seen on his face 11 years ago when she'd first sat in a room with him, which was the expression of a man reserving judgment until judgment was necessary. "You're late," he said. "I was in a meeting," she said. "With who?" "Voss?" The room changed. She felt it, the same atmospheric shift she'd felt in the council chamber 2 nights ago, but different in quality. That shift had been the discomfort of men watching something unexpected. This was something older and more dangerous, the specific stillness of 7 very powerful, very frightened people, understanding that the threat they'd been half aware of had just been confirmed as real. Marcus Hale spoke first. "Voss is dead. He faked it 7 years ago." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each of them in turn, brief but deliberate. "He's been in this city for at least 6 months. He recruited someone inside the compound 4 years ago and spent the intervening time building a complete picture of every alliance, every agreement, every back channel that holds this council together." She paused. "His plan was to use the power transition, the removal of my authority, as a destabilizing event, then move against the physical operations while everyone was confused about who was responsible. He intended for you to believe I'd done it." Silence. "Why?" Rafael Castellano said. Because he blames the peace architecture for creating the federal exposure that destroyed him in 2019. She kept her voice steady. He's not wrong that the architecture created visibility. He's wrong about what that means, and wrong about the solution. You talked to him, Ferrante said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the tone of a man assembling information. Yes. And the convoy is safe tonight. His operation stands down. She paused. In exchange for terms I'll explain in full. But the immediate situation, the threat to operations, the active destabilization, it's over as of this afternoon. The room absorbed that. The person inside the compound, Sung-Jin Park, said. He spoke the same way he always spoke, precisely, without excess. Rourke. Yes. Does Damien know? Not yet. She looked at Park. That's the next conversation. You're going to tell him, Ferrante said, not a question. I'm going to tell him everything, she said. All of it. What Rourke was, what Voss had, what the compound's infrastructure actually looked like, and who actually built it. She paused. He needs the full picture. Not because he deserves it. Because the Vescry Syndicate is one of 7 families in this room, and the stability of this council requires that its head operates with accurate information. Even if that information makes him look... Hale stopped. Foolish? She said it without heat. Yes. Even then. The room was quiet for a moment. It was Eduardo Benitez who broke it, not with words, but by moving to stand slightly closer to where she was standing, a small, physical statement that most people in the room would read correctly. Then, after a moment, Sung-Jin Park shifted his weight in the same direction. Not dramatic, not declarative, just the quiet repositioning of people who'd made a decision. Ferrante watched this. Then he uncrossed his arms. What are the terms with Voss? He said. She told them. All of it, precisely. The way she explained things when the people listening needed to make decisions based on what she said. No softening, no management of reaction, just the clean delivery of the structure she'd proposed and Voss had accepted. She watched their faces while she talked. She'd been watching faces in rooms like this for 14 years, and she knew how to read the difference between resistance and processing, between the skepticism that was preparing an objection and the skepticism that was simply the right response to new information in a high-stakes situation. When she finished, Ferrante was quiet for a long moment. You're asking us to accept a man's word, Rafael Castellano said, a man who spent 7 years trying to destroy us. I'm asking you to accept a structure, Vivienne said. Not his word. The structure makes his word irrelevant. Either he honors it and gains what I offered, or he doesn't, and the exposure he's been avoiding for 7 years becomes immediate. She paused. I don't trust him. I don't need to. The terms create an alignment of interest that holds regardless of trust. And the Kellen situation, Ferrante said, inside the federal office, being handled today. She paused. Through channels that don't create exposure for anyone in this room. He looked at her for a long moment. The old man who'd walked out of a council chamber 2 nights ago because a woman he respected had been publicly stripped of the only position she'd ever used to help people like him, and who'd stood on a lawn in the dark and said, "We're not here to take sides in a marriage." All right, Ferrante said. It was 2 words quietly delivered from a man who didn't use more words than necessary. But in the specific vocabulary of the room they were in, those 2 words had the weight of a document. One by one, the others followed. Not dramatically, not with speeches, just the small, definitive nods of people who'd made a decision and were moving on. She drove to the compound at 4 o'clock. Damien was in his father's study when she arrived. Not the council chamber, not the operations center, but the room at the top of the house where his father had kept his books and his ledgers and the photographs of people who were mostly dead. She'd always thought he came here when he was frightened, though he'd never have used that word. He'd say he was thinking. He was always thinking in this room when the rest of the world had stopped making sense. Rourke was not in the compound. She'd confirmed this with the gate before she came through. He'd left 3 hours ago, on foot, through the east fence, through the gap he'd told Damien needed repairing 3 years ago, and that had never been repaired. She didn't know where he'd gone, and she'd made a decision she was still working out the full dimensions of. She wasn't going to look, not because he deserved to walk away clean. He didn't, but because the thing that had made him reachable, the grief over Elena, the unanswered question about what had happened in 2014, was a thing she intended to answer, and she couldn't answer it if he was in a room facing Damien's particular version of accountability. She needed him to surface eventually, in the right context, when she was ready to give him what she'd promised. She found Damien sitting at his father's desk. Not behind it, in the chair to the side, the chair for visitors, as if he'd sat down in the room and found he couldn't bring himself to take the position of authority. He was in the same clothes as yesterday, and he hadn't shaved, and he looked like a man who'd spent 20 hours inside the specific exhaustion of realizing that the story he'd been telling himself about his own life was constructed on a foundation he'd never actually examined. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Rourke," he said finally. "Yes." "How long?" 4 years. He absorbed that. She watched his face do the calculation. 4 years, what 4 years meant. What had passed through Rourke's hands, and therefore through other hands in 4 years. And she watched him reach the far side of it and find nothing comfortable there. "The communications," he said. "Yes." "The warehouse." "Yes." He gave them everything. Everything he had access to. She came further into the room. She didn't sit. She stood in the middle of the floor and looked at him in his father's chair and said what she'd come to say. "I need to tell you what the compound's infrastructure actually looked like, what I built and how, and what it connected to. All of it." She paused. "I should have told you years ago. I didn't, for reasons I could justify at the time, and that looked different now." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you today because you need the full picture to run this family, and because the people on this council deserve a head who's operating with accurate information." Damien looked at her. She thought he might argue, might push back, might use the gap in her delivery to find the angle that made him the wronged party, which was what he'd always been skilled at, finding the frame that let him remain the central figure even in situations that weren't about him. She'd watched him do it for 11 years, and she'd learned to be patient with it the way you were patient with weather. He didn't do it. He looked at his hands on the arms of the chair, and he said, "Tell me." So she told him. She stood in his father's study, and she told him everything. The infrastructure, the back channels, the relationships she'd built over 14 years that had been operating under his name without his knowledge. Not to deceive him, but because the work required patience and access that she'd had, and he hadn't thought to use. She told him about Voss, and about Rourke, and about the framework with Varner that had been building for 8 years. She told him about the notebook. She told him about the council meeting 2 nights ago and what the 7 Dawns had said to her on the lawn and why they'd followed her rather than him. She told him because it was true and because he needed it and because she had made a decision somewhere in the past 48 hours that she was done building things in the dark. Not because she'd been wrong to do it, because the cost of invisibility was that everything invisible became a vulnerability eventually, and she was finished paying that particular price. He listened. He didn't interrupt. She'd expected interruption. That was his habit, his management technique, the way he maintained control of a room. But he sat in his father's chair and he listened to all of it, and his face went through a sequence of expressions she didn't try to name because they were his, and some of them were difficult, and they were none of her business. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Celeste," he said. "That's your decision," she said. "Not mine. What I did in the council chamber is done." She said it without anger. "It can't be undone. What happens next is a different question." He looked at her. "What does happen next?" "The council reconvenes, not here, on neutral ground. Ferrante will choose the location." She paused. "Voss's terms get presented to the full table and ratified. The Kellen situation gets resolved and the Varner framework moves forward under my oversight, not the Syndicate's. And you," she paused again, "you run this family with the full picture this time. All of it visible, all of it understood." She held his gaze. And you don't make unilateral decisions about the council's political structure without consulting the people whose relationships make that structure function. You're setting terms, he said. I'm describing reality, she said. You can call it terms if you want. He was quiet. She waited. She had spent 14 years learning to wait in rooms with this man, to let the silence do what silence did, to resist the instinct to fill it, to understand that the things people said in silence were almost always more honest than the things they said before it. I need you to come back, he said. It came out lower than his usual register, stripped of the confident projection he'd spent his adult life perfecting. Not to the compound, to the work. What you do, he stopped. What you've been doing. I need it to continue. I know, she said. Is that a yes? It's an acknowledgement that you're right. She looked at him steadily. Whether I continue is something I'm still deciding, not because I'm punishing you, because I'm deciding. She paused. I'll have an answer for you after the council meeting. She left him in his father's study. The council met 8 days later. Not in the compound's chamber. Ferrante chose a property in Connecticut that belonged to no family and had been used once before, 15 years ago, for a meeting that had ended a territorial conflict that might otherwise have lasted a decade. The symmetry was not accidental. Ferrante had a sense of occasion. Vivienne arrived before any of the others. She stood in the chamber alone for a few minutes. A room she hadn't seen before, different dimensions than the one she knew. Natural light coming in through high windows, no amber artificiality, just the clear gray light of November moving across a long table and 7 chairs. No 8th chair. She hadn't asked for one. She wasn't going to sit at this table. The families arrived over 20 minutes. They came in and took their seats, and the room filled with the specific quality of men who'd been through something difficult and were still processing it, quieter than usual, more careful, the particular attentiveness of people who'd been reminded recently that the situations they'd believed stable could move fast and damage widely. Damien came in last. He'd shaved. He wore a dark suit that was his, not chosen for him. He looked like himself, which was different from the man she'd seen in his father's study 8 days ago. Reconstructed, contained, but carrying something around the eyes that hadn't been there before the week that had just passed. Something that looked like the beginning of a kind of knowledge that couldn't be unfamiliar again. He sat. She stood at the far end of the room, not at the table's head, to the side, where she'd always stood when she wasn't formally seated, the position she'd occupied in many rooms over many years, visible without being central. She waited until they'd all settled and the room had reached the particular quality of silence that meant everyone understood the meeting was beginning. Then she presented the terms. She did it the way she did everything in rooms like this, precisely, without performance, with the understanding that the people listening needed information rather than persuasion. Voss's terms, his structure, the logic of alignment she'd constructed, the specific protections that made the arrangement durable rather than dependent on anyone's goodwill. She answered questions. There were good ones. Marcus Hale pressed on the enforcement mechanism. Sungjin Park identified a gap in the logistics framework that she'd already accounted for, but that his identification of confirmed he'd been thinking carefully. The Castellano brothers had coordinated their concerns in advance, which she'd expected, and she walked through them without impatience. At the end, Ferrante looked around the table. One by one, they agreed. Not unanimously at first. Hale took 3 minutes of additional conversation before he was satisfied, and the Castellano brothers wanted a specific term modified, which she agreed to because the modification was reasonable, and being unreasonable here would cost more than the concession. But eventually, in the flat, clear light of a November afternoon in Connecticut, the 7 families closed the largest open wound in the American underworld's recent memory with the specific, undramatic finality of people who'd decided to stop bleeding. Damien voted with them. He didn't look at her when he did it. He looked at the table, at the space in front of him, with the expression of a man making a decision that cost him something real and had decided to pay it anyway. She respected that. She didn't let the respect show on her face, but she felt it quietly, the way she felt most things, privately, without announcement. After the vote, after the room began to move toward the careful business of transition and implementation, Ferrante came to stand beside her. He looked at the table for a moment without speaking. She waited. "The empty chair," he said. "I didn't want a chair." "I know you didn't." He looked at her. "That's why it matters." She thought about what to say to that and decided the right answer was nothing. Some things landed better without a response attached. "What will you do?" he said. "After this." "Continue," she said. "The work doesn't change. The visibility does, somewhat." She paused. "And the Varner framework moves forward. It'll take time to build correctly with Kellen removed, but it's more important now than it was a week ago." She paused again. "There are structures that need to exist on both sides of a line, not because the line is wrong, because the line is only as useful as the people who understand exactly where it runs." Ferrante looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who was 73 years old and had seen a great many things and had decided this was one of the more unusual ones. "You should have had a seat at that table 15 years ago, he said. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe I was more useful where I was." He made a sound that might have been a laugh in a different context. Then he moved back toward the table and the careful, necessary work of rebuilding what the past week had damaged. She stayed where she was for a moment longer. She thought about Rourke. He'd sent a message 6 days ago, not to her directly, through a channel she recognized as one she'd established years ago and that he'd apparently retained access to. The message was 4 words. "Elena, I want to know." She'd sent 4 words back. "I'll find out." Wait. She hadn't heard from him since. She would. She'd meant what she'd promised him. Not because he'd earned it, but because the truth about what had happened to Elena Rourke in 2014 was something that existed regardless of what her father had done, and something that deserved to be known regardless of the cost of knowing it. She thought about Celeste Rowan. She'd left the compound the morning after the council meeting, quietly, with a car she'd arranged herself and 2 bags she'd packed without help. And she'd gone somewhere that wasn't Vivienne's business, and wasn't anyone else's either. She was not a villain. She was a woman who'd made choices in a situation she probably hadn't fully understood, and the choices had carried her somewhere she hadn't expected, and now she was somewhere else. That was the whole story, and it was sufficient. She thought about Voss. He was in the city. She knew that. Would always know it now. The way you knew the location of a structural problem you'd decided to manage rather than demolish. The alignment of interest would hold as long as the terms created value for both sides, and she intended to make sure they continued to, not out of generosity, out of the understanding that the most durable arrangements were the ones where both parties had a reason to maintain them. She thought about Damien. He was at the table, talking to Hale, his posture slightly different than it had been a week ago. Less the careful performance of authority, more the actual weight of it, which was heavier and less comfortable but more real. She didn't know what their marriage was going to become. She'd meant what she said in his father's study. She was still deciding, not as a punishment, but as a genuine and ongoing reckoning with what she wanted, which was a question she'd deferred for long enough that answering it was going to require more time than she'd yet had. She thought about the notebook. It was in her bag, as it had been for 11 years, 40 pages of shorthand that constituted the most complete map of invisible power in the American underworld. She'd thought sometimes about what she was going to do with it eventually, when the time was right, when the framework was solid enough, when the line between the 2 worlds she moved between had been understood by enough people on both sides to make what it contained useful rather than just dangerous. That time was getting closer. Not today. She looked at the room one more time. The 7 families at the table, the November light through the high windows, the empty chair at the table's head that no one had sat in and that no one, she thought, was going to sit in. Not because it was reserved for her, but because the meeting had found its shape without one person at the head of it, and that shape had held. That was the work. Not the chair, not the title, not the authority, not the recognition. The shape of a room full of dangerous people who decided, against every instinct, to build something rather than destroy it. She'd done that. She picked up her bag. She walked out of the room without announcing her departure, and nobody stopped her, and nobody needed to, and the door closed behind her with a sound that was soft and final and complete. And in the corridor outside, she stood for a moment in the quiet and breathed the ordinary air of a building that didn't know what had just happened inside it And then she walked toward the exit and the gray November light beyond it, and the work that was already waiting, and the long, unglamorous, necessary business of holding the world together from the places no one thinks to look.